Welcome to the University of Philosophical Research. This is our panel discussion, Literature as a Path to Wisdom. I don't know if you know about us, if you've been here before, some of you have. We were founded in 1934 by Manly P. Hall as the Philosophical Research Society, and since 2001 we have also been an online university. We have a library, beautiful, famous library, open on Fridays from 10:30 to 3:30 and on Tuesdays from 5 to 7. Our art gallery is also open during those hours, and we have a bookstore that's open from 10 to 4 Monday through Friday-ish. Sometimes that changes a little bit. So let me introduce our panel. We have James Bubar, a graduate of Stone Coast Writing Program with an MFA in fiction and concentration in literary theory. His teaching includes intensive college seminars, lectures, online teaching, and even a seminar in the streets in St. Petersburg, Russia, which sounds very cool. He lives, works, and writes in Izmir, Turkey. He's fascinated with how literature refuses to stay in books, as encounters with readers inspire reflection, understanding, dialogue, engagement, and foster more reading as seeking.
You do it.
Hello, James Bubar.
My assistant did a great job with that description.
And next we have Greg Salyer, PhD. He is the president of the University of Philosophical Research and the CEO of the Philosophical Research Society. For 25 years, he has been an administrator and scholar in higher education institutions, but his calling has always been that of teacher. Trained in interdisciplinary studies, Dr. Salyer moves through the disciplines of literature, philosophy, and religious studies, looking for and helping his students find practical and profound wisdom in the stories, texts, and ideas created all over the world and throughout history. And I can tell you, as his employee, that is true. Hello, Greg.
I wrote my own.
It's really good. And we have Matthew Taylor, my charming coworker. He is the Director of Academic Services at the University of Philosophical Research, where he works with faculty to develop courses that enrich and broaden our curricula. His academic background is in interdisciplinary studies with an emphasis on literature and critical theory. The Director of Marketing thinks he's the coolest. She really does, but I do too.
My intern wrote that.
So, welcome, panel. Ready to get started, James Bubar?
Yeah, I think we're just going to talk for a few minutes each, sharing kind of thoughts about the discussion, and then expand it outward. And I'm really looking forward to just the interaction. Before I get started, I just want to say that about 23 years ago, I was driving down Griffith Park and saw Philosophical Research Society, and almost ran over somebody turning and going into the bookstore. And it's an honor, really, to be here, because for 20-something years, what I experienced here has really informed my reading and my life. And to be on this panel with Greg and Matt, who we've co-read a lot, co-taught a lot, and it's a joy to be here. So my remarks start with a story. In 2002, it was the Steinbeck Centennial, and I had published on Steinbeck and done some classes utilizing Steinbeck, and I was invited to speak at an elder care day community center. And so I put together about an hour lecture on the importance of John Steinbeck. And I went to the event, and it was about 100 people, and I was terrified. And it was right before I was about to speak, and I'm really terrified because, you know, it's one thing talking to undergraduate students, many of who love literature already, about why literature is meaningful. But I was really intimidated by being in a room of 100 people in their 70s and above, thinking of all the loss in their life, thinking about all the challenges they faced, literally the wisdom. And here was going to be a test. You know, if literature matters, you know, here, I felt that it would be vindicated, but I didn't know if it did. It was going to be very intense for me. So I do the talk, and I'm antsy because everyone's waiting for me to finish so we can have our spaghetti. And there's a gentleman, a Hispanic gentleman in his late 70s in the front row, writing notes all the time. And after the discussion, he came up to me and he said, "I want to thank you because I had never heard of Steinbeck, and now I'm going to go read all of his books." And that was a really profound interaction for me. And I think ever since then, but not just since then, or not just because of that, I've always thought about, why does it matter? Why does literature matter to us? And so literature is a path to wisdom. I started to think about our title. So in the first sense, we're always thinking about what is literature, and I think all of us up here would agree on a wide definition about, epic poetry, nonfiction, essay writing. But there's always arguments about, there's a long history of some literature being good, some literature being harmful, even dangerous. And then there's endless debates about genre. Can a book like Paulo Coelho's The Alchemist mean as much as Dostoevsky's Brothers Karamazov? So as we go through our title, that's one of the frames I want to set. The second one is path. And for me, path implies devotion and practice. So how is it in our reading, our study or reading of literature, can we bring a devotionary aspect or a path element to it? Who are the masters? Are there any? Can we do it alone? It seems strange where in so many of our other spiritual systems, we need dialogue, we need masters. Can we do it alone? Should we do it alone? When Alexander the Great first read his letters from his mom when he was in Athens, everyone thought he was crazy because the Greeks were customary reading everything out loud, not just oral, but just reading to each other. And so is that something we need to get in touch with in order to make it a practice? And then how do we incorporate ritual? Creating a ritual space or ritual activity that may enhance whatever wisdom we can find within literature. And which brings me to wisdom, a loaded term. I was talking with Greg earlier about maybe we should have put a question mark at the end of it, because the path seems to imply that we're done. Yeah, okay, we finished it. We know that literature is a path to wisdom, but it seems an open and loaded term. Now, of course, I think we would all agree there's a lot of information in literature. It can be moral edifying, culturally expansive, intellectually expansive, but literature's under attack a lot. Maybe not having the dynamism of oral storytelling, some works being considered culturally inappropriate or insensitive, some banned. And even within literature, some works are considered escapist, not seeking or finding meaning for life, but hiding from life. There's a kind of pragmatic element in the world now that we talk about, that you can get great skills from reading, how to connect with others. And some of these are great, how to expand your empathy, understand what people have gone through. There's the notion of finding encouragement through your own adversity in the way that characters or even authors find encouragement to go on. And I think all of these are important. Especially, I think it's C.S. Lewis who had the idea that we read so we're not alone, that we encounter another kind of human being in the words. But I think as a frame for the discussion, that there's an element of wisdom that is revelatory, that is something happens, it's a revelation. It's an encounter with the transcendent. Tolkien talked about the secondary reality that the author creates, and that he is almost as a shaman going somewhere else and taking us with him or her. And as we come back, we re-see our world, or we see our world anew. And so I'm particularly interested in that aspect of the wisdom. I guess you could say the mystical tradition, or the encounter tradition of something happens and we're not the same when we come through a great work. And so I'll end it with just the words not necessarily the words of Socrates, but this idea. I think as I get older, I realize that the more I read, the more I have to read. So it seems to be similar to that Socratic notion of the only thing we know is how much we don't know. And then I'll just end with Steinbeck's closure to his Nobel Prize for Literature address, when he talked about literature grew out of the need for human speech. And it hasn't changed except to be more needed. And that was 40 years ago. And I do believe it's more needed. So part of this discussion is it's more needed because it helps us find wisdom. Thank you.
Matthew.
All right. So when I was in college, I spent a semester abroad in Ghana working on a research project focused on oral storytelling traditions. I found the entirety of the field research experience and the majority of the supplemental scholarship fascinating and enriching, but there was one common refrain in the scholarly work that I thought to be imprecise. It was this notion that oral storytelling's dynamic quality had to be contrasted with written literature, which was portrayed as always static. The implication was that, having been written down, a novel would not change or evolve based on readings and rereadings, both individual and cultural. I don't mean to diminish the uniqueness of oral storytelling's performance, improvisation, and other singular properties, but I think that it is incorrect to claim that written literature is inherently immobile or fixed. And I think that this misunderstanding or misreading is an unfortunately prevalent one, even if it isn't often explicitly stated this way. Anybody who has read a much-loved book at different stages in their life has surely discovered that the text opens itself up in new ways each time, that something previously undiscovered is now illuminated. Whether it's because of life experience, other books that we consciously or unconsciously put in dialogue with the current text, or just the way that we develop and sharpen our sensibilities as readers, rereading is always, in some sense, reading for the first time. And unexpected encounters within familiar texts teach us how to be more attentive and receptive readers of literature and of the people we meet and of our own lives. All of this is to say, I think it's a mistake to conceive of reading as a merely passive pleasure, a reprieve from the world in which a story is transmitted to us unilaterally. When we engage actively with a text, we discover and gain and grapple with so much more. And that is also when we find for ourselves that any great piece of literature is indeed dynamic, constantly in motion and in dialogue, with the reader, with the rest of literature, and with the multitudes of voices contained within itself. In any great book, the questions that arise are developed and explored from multiple vantage points, but they are never permanently resolved or settled. That is why the truths that we discover through reading are inseparable from the act of reading. They cannot be translated into, or more aptly, reduced to, aphorisms or adages. Every piece of literature has multitudes of voices vying for dominance, but it does not and cannot confer the status of uncomplicated truth on any one of them. Because this polyphony makes every truth complex and ambiguous, always in some way undermined and developed further as a result, leading always to more possible meanings. This isn't to grant legitimacy to crude arguments about there being no determinate reality and no truths that are not ultimately subjective, because those notions proclaim their own version of finality, an end to the motion that is one of the animating forces of great literature. When as readers we sit with and think through contradictions and paradox rather than trying to eliminate or reduce them, we can then bring that wisdom that we encounter in literature into our own lives. There is undoubtedly consolation in totalizing reductive narratives that allow us to make a simple cognitive map of the world. That's the appeal of conspiracy theories, of certain political movements, and so on. But there's no wisdom in that consolation. Literature makes our world more intelligible and meaningful, but it also demonstrates to us the vastness and boundlessness of that world. And this is where we encounter some of the greatest wisdom, coming face to face with the scope of our own ignorance, coming to terms with the fact that the more we read, the more we are confronted with all that which we will never know. And if an encounter with a great book leads us to glimpse the ways in which the world is rich and always in motion, inexhaustible and never fully comprehensible, then I think we are doing a fine job as readers.
Thank you, Matthew. Greg?
Thank you, Brooke. I was born inside a literary text. I just didn't know it was literature. I grew up in the South, a small town in the mountains of Tennessee. I lived across from the Southern Baptist Church, which had as its center and as the center of our world, the axis mundi, the inerrant Word of God, the biblical text. It was presented as truth, and to stray from it meant to stray into error and into sin. This text was the center of my life. The people at that church were my entire world. I didn't know anyone who did not go to that little church. So I decided to pursue this truth, and so began to study it in college, this text, and in graduate school, and it fell apart. Because the closer I looked, the less it held together. Or I should say, the less that the interpretation I was given held together. Inerrant Word of God, it was a pastiche of many authors and many times and many places, inherently contradictory at times, deliberately contradictory at times, with such as in the genealogy of Matthew, who gets his genealogy wrong, but for reasons other than truth. The deeper I got into the text, the less it held for me, and my whole life was built on this text. Not as a literary text, I repeat, but as a text on the way to truth, a vehicle for truth. So I remember in graduate school reading the New Testament in Greek and literally saying out loud, uh-oh, because I could see the problems with the text. And I had built my life on this text. And so my life fell away. My marriage ended. My studies ended because of a text. I had nothing. It was just loss, emptiness, because I had treated this text as truth. Loss and literature have a great relationship. J. Hillis Miller said that all storytelling is constructed over loss, and he was right. I think storytelling is an attempt to weave together the holes in the fabric of our consciousness and in our culture. And so I said goodbye to the text and drifted in the desert for a while, but came back to it through an interesting text and an interesting teacher. My last course in my graduate program was a course called Literary Criticism of the Bible, and the text was the book of Revelation. Apocalypse and apocalypse, right? I was going through my own apocalypse, and I was studying the apocalypse for the first time as a literary text. No longer did we worry about historicity, truth, theology. We looked at character, story development, roundness or flatness of characters, plot, symbol. And suddenly, I saw a way out. And it was literature. And so I began a doctoral program at Emory University doing I wanted to do literary readings of the biblical text because that had changed my life. I left that program doing religious readings of contemporary fiction, and so flipped to the other side, if there is a side. And then I got my first job in the Department of Religion and Philosophy. But by the time I left that job, I was the chair of the English department. So this story is my story, this story of literature, because I went from a seeker of truth to a seeker of meaning. I didn't find the truth, but I found so much meaning. And I found it not just in literature, but in literary approaches to reading. What does that mean? That means instead of looking for one single, ultimate, objective, absolute truth, you look for meaning. And there can be as many meanings as there are people. There are actually more meanings than there are people because we inhabit and use so many. And so one of the great things I was able to do at this first job, this little college in Montgomery, Alabama, this little church-related college, is I taught a course called Blue Highways, which was an embodiment of a book by the same name by William Lee Steep Moon. And it was a road trip in January with students that had 4 rules. No destination, we just get up and go. No interstates or freeways, only back roads. No fast food, only local diners where you eat local food and meet local people. And no backtracking. You don't cover the same ground twice. And apart from Blue Highways, one of the texts we read, and we would get up in the campground and I would read it every morning, a passage, and it was Walt Whitman's Song of the Open Road. And that has become my Bible. And here's just a little piece of it. Speaking of literature and wisdom, listen to this. From this hour, I ordain myself loosed of limits and imaginary lines, going where I will, my own master, total and absolute, listening to others, considering well what they say, pausing, searching, receiving, contemplating, gently, but with undeniable will, divesting myself of the holds that would hold me. I inhale great draughts of space. The east and west are mine, the north and south are mine. I am larger, much better than I thought. I did not know I held so much goodness. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Loved all three of those things. Every time I think about Steinbeck, I think of when I was in 7th grade reading The Red Pony, the scene where the vulture is pecking out the dead pony's eyeball. It's stuck in my brain. A very vivid scene. It's so visceral and powerful, and part of the transformative power of literature, I think, is that visceral reaction to things like that, especially things that we read when we're very young, that can set a tone for what we like forever. Do you have any particular Steinbeck or anything, scenes that you would like to talk about?
Well, there's a couple things that Steinbeck embodies that we've been talking about. Like, he said that reading Crime and Punishment was more vivid than his own memories. So in that sense, about encountering things, not only expanding ourselves or finding new selves, but this sense that a Russian writer can write in 1865 and he reads it, Steinbeck reads it 40, 50 years later and thinks it's more real than his own memories. But there's something in Steinbeck, I think, that's really important about paying attention because it's his focus on sight. He's often considered, the super journalist. I mean, he's obviously a great, great fiction writer, but he was such the chronicler, whether in Grapes of Wrath and there's an interesting story about, a lot of Steinbeck just took from the world, so literature almost is training us to see, whether we're writing it or whether we're encountering the author's offering. We're somehow, seeing, and Stanley Fish, the great literary theorist, says, love is paying attention. And so there's this notion of when you're seeking, first being able to see. And that and when you're encountering Steinbeck's art in particular, you're really aware that you're seeing things. Gore Vidal said that he wrote about people that no one had ever written about before, and probably not since. Mm-hmm. He was the person who worked as a ditch digger but thought like a philosopher. Mm-hmm. And there's a fascinating story about Red Pony that apparently, it could be apocryphal, but apparently he lost the manuscript. The only manuscript.
Wow.
And when they were moving, and he had to write it again.
Wow. And
then years later, they found it behind a trunk, and they compared the manuscripts, and there was only a few words difference.
I love that.
Yeah. I don't think I could ever write the same introduction twice. But, it's this notion when I read Steinbeck, I'm very conscious of, compassion, but also seeing.
Yeah, very
seeing
visual.
The world.
Yeah.
And in that sense, that encounter with literature and a path to wisdom is, like in Greg's case, starting to see beyond the text he was kind of given, or in our relationships, or in our just imagining possibilities, or just being able to, a commonality with Dostoevsky is being able to just pay attention to something we may have missed. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Thank you.
That's a great memory and a great way to approach literature, is your first encounter. Mm-hmm. So, like I said, the Bible was kind of given to me. I didn't meet it. It met me when I entered the world. But I remember my first encounter was with James Dickey's Deliverance.
Oh.
So if you don't know, you know, right? James Dickey's Deliverance, yeah. Brutal. You know the film if you don't know the novel. Brutal, horrific, exciting, thrilling novel and film. But I reread it every year starting as a teenager. And what my favorite part was the ascent up the cliff. And I never understood it. I'm like, I've got whitewater, canoeing, I've got death, destruction, I've got other things we don't have to talk about. Why do I keep reading about this ascent? And it was because it was poetry, and it was because it was going beyond my current knowledge and encountering the other, and ultimately encountering the sacred. And James Dickey.
Yeah, so going back to Steinbeck, he was one of the first authors that for me, there's this notion that literature and the books you have can kind of be a roadmap of your life. And Steinbeck is one of the first ones I had that for, and one of the first times I discovered how significant rereading could be. I first read Grapes of Wrath as a junior in high school. And my freshman year, I took a Steinbeck class that James taught. We had actually met when I was 16 and came to visit the campus, and he was wearing a Steinbeck shirt, and we talked about Steinbeck for 2 hours.
Have enough books.
Right, it said you can never have enough books. And I chose to come to Redlands my freshman year. I took the course with him. We read a Steinbeck book every week. And of course, it was very different than reading it just a few years ago when I was a junior in high school. My senior year, I taught that course, slightly differently, slightly different syllabus, but the same idea. And James was in New York, and we would talk before the class each day. So it was kind of this marker of how our talks about Steinbeck evolved in terms of like a mentor in my life, and also in terms of my rereading each time. And when we talk about place and the way that many books can be, like Ulysses is a map of Dublin at that time. And for Steinbeck, a lot of that was Monterey, and specifically Cannery Row. And that year that I taught it, I was able to take all the students in my class up to Monterey, and we camped there and explored Cannery Row, and we went to Doc Rickett's lab. And it enriched the reading so much. And what I saw looking back on my high school notebooks when I was teaching it as a senior in college was that I would get new layers of meaning each time, but it never diminished those first ones. It wasn't such a absolute hierarchy. It wasn't as if what I had encountered at 16 was so much less than what I encountered later. There were just these different layers, and it depended on my life and my reading at that time.
I'm really glad you brought up your trip to Cannery Row, because I was thinking about getting ready for the talk when I mentioned practice. What do I do just intentionally, and maybe what do I do that I'm not aware of until I ask myself the question, how do I make this practice of reading more ritualistic? And giving it the same ritual that you may give meditation or attending church service or prayer. And I know part of it is talking, but I think we do it so much, maybe it's not in a enclosed ritual space. And a commonality between going to Cannery Row multiple times, but also the work I did in Russia with a Dostoevsky seminar in the streets, is this notion of pilgrimage. And I hadn't really thought about it until getting ready for this talk, that finding a place, whether it's the author's house or the setting of a book or Blue Highways, could be any highway, or here, right, is just this sense of it'll open up new meanings by giving it a sense, by using that notion of pilgrimage along with the text. And then the notion of rereading. There's a few books, I think we all have them, but I'm now consciously trying to read every year or every other year as a marker to draw more deeply from the book, but also to see what new things I discover. So that's another aspect of ritual. And then finding reading space. So now in my house, it sounds kind of crazy. I've been reading forever, very intensely, but now I have a space in the same way you would have a meditation or a prayer space in your house. And these are all things that have just come up since we started talking about that. And I think they've all yielded a deeper or at least new insights into familiar or new texts.
Do you have a time of day in addition to a space?
I have a weekend.
Okay.
So every Saturday afternoon for a while. And then before I meditate at night, I'll read about it. But I talk to people who are older than I. Dr. Heller, who is a mentor of mine, who speaks here, has a long history with the plays. He reads Lord of the Rings every year.
Oh.
Still, and I mean, he's read it like 40 times. And so it doesn't have to be, I guess, the right book, but when you find the book that speaks to you, to not let that relationship go.
It will change over time, as Matthew was
Yeah.
saying earlier. I like to read Pride and Prejudice a lot.
Say the line. Say it.
But your good opinion is rarely bestowed and therefore more worth the earning. So I find that I like Mr. Darcy now much more than I did when I was younger. I was more of a Lizzie Bennet person. Now I might be more of a Mr. Darcy person, but I expect that position to change. As I get into my dotage, maybe I'll be at Catherine de Bourgh. We'll see what happens.
Does any of this resonate with you as a woman? Did you encounter literature in similar or different ways?
Well, I think about what I connected with most powerfully when I was young that sort of stuck with me. I like vivid visual descriptions and powerfully emotional descriptions, and that sort of continued. But I also have always had a taste for sort of grisly description, and I don't know if that's because of what I was exposed to when I was very young or just if it's a natural inclination. But I don't like to read anything too gory, but romantic kind of darkness.
Romantic darkness. That should have been our title.
One more quick thing about rereading. I think something that's always interesting for me and that I kind of got at in my intro is the way that something that you took out of the text as its thesis or something like that the first time can be undermined or complicated in later readings, especially when you read a really advanced novel for the first time as a young person. It might be the most powerfully stated or something like that pulls at you. Like in Brothers Karamazov, the Grand Inquisitor might be to you the central thesis of the book. And that's this whole central part of Brothers Karamazov, for those who haven't read it, where somebody says, if a single child suffers, then I reject God, I return the ticket. And I think when I read that as a young person, that to me was the thesis of the book. But when you go back and revisit it, seeing the ways that is actually undermined and that you can find some affirmation in the face of that is really fascinating.
Well, since Greg brought up the apocalypse, I'll bring up Job. Besides the great quote you had about loss, I think it was Faulkner who said, Tennessee Williams, who said, what's literature about? Loss, loss, loss. And Kierkegaard, and it's not just the story of Job, although I'm sure that would work in an oral sense, just knowing it and keeping it with you, but he was very specific about the text. And he says he has this beautiful paragraph describing the written story of Job, kind of accompanying every person through their life for centuries. And it's a great image of not just that text, but the stories that either speak to us specifically or some of the great novels. He mentioned Brothers Karamazov, which was the second most important religious novel next to Dante of the second millennium or something like that. So there's some texts we agree on. But finding those books that your companions that will accompany you, but that image of the text of Job and its power, kind of walking through, humanities and kind of accompanying humanity through all their suffering. I think the same thing could be said about the Buddhist scriptures or the Zhao Zing. So,
the most beautiful book in the Bible,
Yeah.
the Book of Job. It's an early poetry slam.
Yeah.
It really is.
Yeah.
I'll let them.
Yeah. Nick Young?
I used to reread Godfather when I was in
All right.
junior high, so whatever that says about me.
Italian.
I'll play devil's advocate, and I wouldn't, if it weren't that I do have such great respect for literature, and I guess I'm talking more about the novel when I say this. What if literature, novel as a path to knowledge is a biased and a secondary path to knowledge? or a path to secondary knowledge, and that with character and with development, this sort of aspect of time, what if that's a secondary sort of knowledge, and one that's very, informed by modernity, everything, basically since Descartes? What if maybe music is a path to knowledge, and not all music, but like the way Thomas Mann talks about Palestrina versus Mozart. And
Right.
I know this gets complicated here because I just use the novel to refer to that. And even in Dostoevsky, he has those moments of transcendence.
Right.
What if the higher knowledge is, kind of like Eastern wisdom, getting beyond all this motion and everything to something that's more permanent, platonic, Parmenides behind that?
Well, I mean, that's what I was kind of interested in this notion of the encounter, right? And more so than what you'll find in the book or from the book or through the book, but literally encounter. I mean, as Tolkien talks about, you're fundamentally not the same as when you read. So when you read, deeply and attentively, and so I think the music can be, a similar metaphor. Or when Greg will talk about this, but there's the notion of the sacred and the profane. I'm going to a concert tomorrow. I don't know how many people will be there. It's pretty dark. But I know there's something happens at time when you're in a concert space. And it could be, you playing at a small venue. But something happens and we shift into the sacred time as opposed to the linear time of, and that's where I think knowledge is. Kind of learn how to do this, and even if it's moral, if it's aesthetic, even if it's behavioral, a model for life, it's still kind of in that realm of the profane, day to day. But there's that notion when you're in a concert where time seems to shift. And you can often walk out, you're not the same person. Similar in a movie. And I think if we want to go to the novel, it can provide that experience. And that's where you encounter either, as Greg was talking about, his relationship with rereading his own life, or you can encounter this great expanse of humanity in Brothers Karamazov, when Alyosha drops to his knees and then stands up, and the text says that he's now ready for anything in life. And I'm getting chills just talking about it. So I think there's something beyond the profane in that relationship. It may be more akin to prayer, but I think it's more similar to music. And yeah, you could say the novel it does have a modern history, but some people are saying the novel will go all the way back to the early Greek adventure novels.
Who says that, James?
Not me. I'm saying it goes back to the ancient Greek adventure novels.
Mikhail Bakhtin?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. I knew he'd come in here somehow.
We got to get him in.
Yeah, please do.
I think music could be seen as an experience of oral culture.
Yeah.
It's a way for words to be delivered to your ears.
Yeah.
Experience a change, having heard them. Some things get lodged in your head forever.
Yeah.
I agree with you, Nick. Not about the novel being modern, because I'm Bakhtinian, and I think you see the novel in early Greek literature. But I think words go only so far, and then you've got to turn the words in on themselves. And so you go right from there to Cleanth Brooks, the language of paradox. The highest poetry is that which is uses irony, and then you go from there to art, music, and dance. That's why we have an art gallery here, because we're doing all right with words. We have lots of words, but we'd like some images and music and dance.
And
What's that?
I'll also bring up, it seems like a greatest hits of all the readers, the books that we've loved, but Greg is a scholar of the work of Leslie Marmon Silko. And I think another way that it works against the paradigm, even though there's a kind of limit to the words, is in her, I don't know if it's her most famous work, but probably most widely read, is her book Ceremony, which actually is a ceremony. Not only does the character go through a ceremony, but so do you. And it's a very powerful reading experience. So you're kind of going through the same ceremony of a kind of a deconstructing and reconstructing of what you think of the self as you're reading. And so some works are trying to get as immediate beyond the information, beyond the sentences, but more into an experience. The Russian literary theorist that Greg just quoted, Mikhail Bakhtin, talks about literature as being participatory. Or Matt talked about passive reading as the opposite of that. But this notion that this is kind of a screen and we just read it, but Bakhtin attacked that and was talking about you're in the text or you're engaging with it. And that way you can have an experiential aspect to the knowledge. And he said good literature is like a theater without the footlights, he called it. So there's not this fourth wall to the powerful literature, but it's pulling you in, and it's an encounter.
Frankie?
Like you said, participation, that actually is where it moves from just knowledge or just entertainment or whatever to the path of wisdom.
Right.
Any path of wisdom requires participation or is no longer a path of wisdom. So whether that's literature, music, arts, relationships, conversations, when you were there participating, that's when you're on that path, and I know at the time.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. I mean, in one of my mentors, who I think all of us know on the stage, he once said to me, "But how's the book?" I was talking about Ulysses, I think, and he said, "Well, it's reading you back." I was like, "What the hell is he talking about?" I thought I was pretty advanced in terms of theory, and I walked out of his office, and I'm like, I didn't know what he meant. And I graduated, I went to grad school, I was a published writer, I still didn't know really what that meant.
Do you know now?
Yes, because I read this book that Greg and I really kind of, it's like falling in love or having a relationship, and sometimes it doesn't end well, but there was a book by Susan Faludi, who I really recommend. She's I'd say she's an amazing cultural thinker about feminism, but also, male projections. And she has some amazing books. And she wrote a book called Stiffed. And as she was describing the kind of forces that have worked themselves on men, their inability to do things, it was just a very powerful analysis. I had to put the book down and walk outside for a second and take it in. And I've had that experience a lot with novels, but somehow that was where I really understood how a book reads you back. And it happens on all the time, but when you hit these peak experiences in the same way of meditating and in music, when it's a peak experience, there's something beyond, the knowledge you were talking about, and you have to participate and be open.
Yeah, I think in terms of participation also, I believe it was Thomas Mann who said, "You're not reading unless you're reading with a pen in hand, writing in the margins." And I remember just the other day I got to see James do his talk on Dostoevsky in St. Petersburg for the first time, not in St. Petersburg, but you talked a lot about those texts being inscribed on the city and the way that you inscribe yourself on a city and you inscribe your stories on the city. And this literal way in which, when you're reading a text, you're inscribing not only your thoughts, but ideally you're putting other texts that you've encountered into dialogue with it, that you're the one bringing these disparate things into a dialogue that produces new meanings. And that's when you reach these new layers. So.
Yeah, there's someone else who Matt and I know who taught Steinbeck with me, and he did an amazing experience. There's a really interesting thinker named it's spelled Walter Benjamin, if you want to look him up, but it's Walter Benjamin. And he has this notion of sometimes he would just write out his favorite paragraphs, word for word, to just get into, I don't think it's literally get into the author's mind, but do something else with it, almost like a spell, and see what happened, both with understanding maybe the text, but also just getting it into his kind of bloodstream in a different way. Yep. And so we had a friend who rewrote the first paragraph of Cannery Row, which is one of the most beautiful in all of American literature, I think. And he rewrote it probably 50 times. And he would do it at community meetings at our school, and if someone was graduating, he'd rewrite it for Matt, he rewrote it for me. And so that's another aspect that I've been thinking about more in terms of making it a ritual, a thing I can do to get not just a deeper understanding of what that is, but like the statue out here says, thou art that. So in these great texts, seeing what's in me as I'm writing out these amazing paragraphs or scenes.
I used to do that with the first line of Neuromancer.
Really?
The sky was the color of a television tuned to a dead channel.
That is an amazing, okay, maybe that's the best opening line. Yeah.
Oh,
I just, okay, how do I start to say? First of all, I love everything you guys said. Great job.
these
Thank
are
you.
smart people up here.
I also, because I agree with you, and also because I think that because so many of you are men, I feel like it's a really, I would love to ask you about like your thoughts on then the moral imperative to read authors that you
Yeah.
like no cultural commonality with. Because
Right.
if literature is this important, and I
Right.
agree with you that it is,
Yeah.
wouldn't then like Jackie Woodson's Brown Girl Dreaming be like a more important work than ever reading Huck Finn? Like, and then for folks like you are like,
Yeah.
like I'm a gay woman. I've like definitely read about the straight experience.
Right. Right.
Like, would it be a moral imperative for folks that are straight to read like really great books written by queer authors? I'm just curious because I feel like you probably have a lot of really great things to say.
It's a great question.
I love that question.
I'd love to answer that because it's my experience. So what I didn't tell you is what I did my dissertation on, which was two women writers, Margaret Atwood and Louise Erdrich, a Native American writer. So here I am coming from this little Bible-centered community, and now I'm into Margaret Atwood surfacing in Louise Erdrich's tracks, and ended up writing on ceremony as well. It's imperative to do that for so many reasons. One is what Matt and James has been talking about in terms of Bakhtin, which is dialogue. Bakhtin says you cannot know without knowing the other. Because as we sit across from each other, two different worlds are reflected in the pupils of our eyes. And he's not being a romantic.
Right.
He's being a philosopher. He says, literally, this is an epistemology. You must know the other to know at all. And my experience with Native American literature was a ritual in itself. For example, James mentioned ceremony. I started reading it 3 times and I couldn't finish it. Because, as James said, it's a ritual, but it was also that encounter with the other that you're talking about. I finally finished it and I didn't know what the hell I'd just read. But I ended up writing about it. I ended up meeting her and we ended up becoming friends. Because to know, you have to know the other.
And I would just add that, Alexander Pushkin talks about we live how we read, but he was kind of doing it in this negative sense. If people read the wrong novels, romance novels, fantasy escapist novels, but I mean, I think the larger aspect is that's the moral imperative, that there's no excuse, whether it's a teacher or a student, to facilitate engagement with whatever the other may be. But I think it's also imperative to have those voices out there, whether it's in a class or it's encouraging young reading and young writing. Because now, thankfully, you can, I don't know if in your experience, I'd be interested to hear about it, what texts you connected with. Were they very different from your experience, or were they young women, gay women, queer men writers? And I think as a teacher, to facilitate that kind of conversation, which may align, but also disrupt. So that's how I think about it.
Sutinder.
Just want to flip this observation of yours about reading broadly and reading outside of one's own cultural situation in terms of authors. What are your thoughts on writers writing outside of their own? So there's been controversy about this.
Right.
I'm particularly interested because I'm in the process of prepping a writing project, or writing one and prepping another one, that are nothing to do with, don't reflect me as an individual. And I'm very anxious about doing that.
Right.
And there are two schools of thought that one, you should not write about other cultures, and then there are others that say it's absolutely fine. I wonder what your thoughts are on that.
Well, that's a great question, but unfortunately we're run out of time. But I'm sure there's stuff online that you can find. No, I mean, that is a real, both your question as well, although we've had a decades since the canon kind of exploded and we got to bring in other voices, whether marginalized writers, but that is it's a really powerful question, and I think Matt has something to say about that. No, I'm sure we'll all jump in, but thank you for that.
Okay, I'll jump in first. Teacher and student, brutal. Still, you never get out, do you? No. Yeah. That is a great question. I encountered that because it was a white man writing about these native texts. I really struggled with it because I didn't want to be disrespectful. I wanted to respect the storytelling and the culture that gave birth to the storytelling. And I hope this doesn't sound like I'm being an asshole, but the writing itself I saw as a kind of listening. Because in a storytelling culture, listening is the virtue you bring to the speaker. But it's not passive, as Matt was saying. There's an activity to it. And so I remember sending Leslie Marmon Silko my manuscript and just waiting, who the hell are you, Tennessee boy, writing about my culture? But I did it in a way that was, again, as I saw, as an act of listening. And she responded beautifully. And like I said, we became friends. She came and spoke at my school. But I've also been to literary conferences where I've seen writers like that destroyed. It's an interesting, and I understand why. Because it's a people, for native people, it's a people that's been colonized by people like me. And here we are now taking their literature, their voice, their stories, which is all they have. It's not all they have, but it's their lifeblood. And so for someone like me to interpret Leslie Marmon Silko's Thought Woman is potentially and even likely to be offensive. But you have to listen.
Do you think it might be more offensive to write from the perspective of a person who's
Creators.
Yeah.
Great, talking about the critical,
taking a creative license rather than writing about, but assuming the persona or experience of someone whose experience you have not had.
That's right. That's where you get in trouble. How can you do that?
You get in much more trouble if you do that, I would
You
imagine.
should.
Yeah, I think so too.
And I also just wanted to say, I don't have a clear answer on this. I haven't thought it through enough. But I think there are a multitude of ways to do something like this poorly or sloppily or badly, but there are ways to do it well, and I think a lot of those involve being in dialogue and in the revision process and being open to those things. And then also, if you're taking on this kind of project, and I think you're actually a bad writer in general if you don't do this, making sure that you're writing about a particular person with all of the complexities and nuances that entails, rather than trying to make universal proclamations. And that's especially where you'll get in trouble, I think, generally in writing, and even more so in this kind of instance.
Sherman Alexie, the writer, said, if somebody says it's universal, it means white people understand it.
Yeah, sorry, I'm just going to jump on if you have a minute, because go back to, it sounds like we're advertising Mikhail Bakhtin, but as a writer, like a creative writer, trying to write about a woman from the inside or an 80-year-old man from the inside, he has this notion of, I think this is what Matt was touching on, about, the writer's sin is to finalize the character, even though he's fictional, but he talks about Dostoevsky in particular, kind of listening to his characters. And so that's I think the due diligence of trying to approach any character that you're writing about with that same honor and openness and unfinalizability and not objectifying. That's only more important now considering these aspects. And I had a fascinating experience at a Steinbeck conference once, because outside of America, the biggest Steinbeck literary club is in Tokyo. It's kind of strange to me. Exactly. And so we went there, and it was all Japanese scholars, and they were doing some readings of stories that I would have never thought of. And Bakhtin talks about that sometimes the outside has an interesting vision to add to the conversation. And I think the trick is honoring that without reducing it to kind of appropriation or neo-colonialism. When we're writing about something, when I write about Dostoevsky, for example, I'm not Russian, but Bakhtin would say the fact that you're not Russian is going to bring stuff out of the text that adds to the conversation. But if you do that in a way that recreates colonial, a kind of domination or appropriation, that's the real sin.
Frankie?
I think the key word there, because I'm a writer as well, my mentor says that the key to this is empathy.
Yeah.
And if you're writing creatively, unless you're writing one character and it's you and there are no other characters, then you're going to be writing outside your experience.
Right.
Like you can put that on other characters, you'll see your experience out of necessity, but that's be a flat, boring book.
Yeah.
So it's empathy, and I think that's that in itself ties it to natural wisdom as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That's
good.
It gets you out of the colonial, because there's no empathy in colonialism.
Right.
That's the key to it, right? That's the listening. Empathy is listening, but also then trying to embody and experience what you're listening and feel it on those. I mean, that to me is, when I read a book, it's like, well, this is an interesting book, or that's a great book.
Yes.
Because the author had obvious empathy for all these people that don't exist.
Yeah. Dostoevsky used to say, I wanted the character to turn right, but he turned left. But I'm curious about if there's a project you're working on now that have you run into writing about it? Have you run into some of these practically about a particular character, and how did you deal with it? And did you think about the ethical aspect or through craft? What's your experience?
I actually worked on a number of, so the project I'm currently on is one that I sort of enjoy that you threw away earlier when you said in the romance or the fantasy or whatever. Because it's in the romance genre. When I go to class or when I go to get gatherings and stuff, I am the only person in the room like me. It's dominated, that feels dominated by women, and I understand that and I appreciate that, and I feel a responsibility just for being in the room.
Wow.
Now I purposely didn't say I'm the only guy in the room because my identity is not that I'm the male in the room. Everybody knows that. Man, I look like this, and it's a perception. But the only way I'm allowed to stay in that room is to live in empathy and listen. And every question I have, everything that I try to craft in these things, especially when I'm writing dialogue and it's,
Right.
This is a woman speaking now. That, like, the simplest answer is there are literally sensitivity readers that I can pay at a certain point and say, here's my manuscript, can you just tell me any place that you find offensive? That's one way.
Mm-hmm.
But even before that, like, it's literally just being taught, spiritually taught, or taught on, these deeper levels that aren't about the words, the manuscript, it's about life.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't feel that I have approached still being able to do it the way that it needs to be done. But I've learned so much just out of life and these experiences. So I'm hoping that feeds into it.
I love the word you introduced, you brought up, of responsibility. And that's really powerful. And you also highlighted another aspect of literature as wisdom, educating us on, just whether you're thinking about how the writer wrote it, or you're actually writing yourself, or it really is it's teaching us in a kind of multi-dimensionality that we need for this world now.
Amanda Brass.
Hey, if I were to put a person in front of all four of you, and this person says, oh, you like reading, I don't really read anymore, or I never got into it. My question to the panel and Brooke, what little potion, what little magic spell, what little list of literature would you give to someone to inspire them to put down their phone and read?
Well, I work with high school students, so I get this question a lot. Because no one reads anything. I mean, I would be honest, in my current job, it's more about just helping them develop critical thinking skills. I'm in Turkey, so they need to read in English and get good scores in the SAT. So it is more of a pragmatic or a practical aspect. But when students say, "Oh, I don't like to read," and I'll be honest, some people love to read and then they have no problem with it. And I usually tell them, I said, "Well, do you love anything?" And then they'll say something like, I don't think anyone's ever asked them that, but like, what are you passionate about? And they'll usually say something. And I think even in literature as a definition, if it's fashion, I just read a great biography of biographical work of Coco Chanel. And so it's that's the gateway. And maybe they don't have to pick up Dostoevsky, but I think just getting into that encounter with words on a page.
Shaping it to their experience.
Yeah, usually I start from love. I mean, as Joseph Campbell, follow your bliss. And so I'm usually pretty obnoxious. And I say, well, what you don't love anything? There's something you love to talk about. What do you pay attention to when you open your smartphone? And if it's shoes, if it's shop, if it's football. I think one of the great things about the world now is there's so many people writing about everything, whether from perspectives that have been marginalized or just about really interesting stuff. And that can be turned to. So I wouldn't necessarily recommend a book. I'd listen, as Greg said. That's how I try to talk to students.
It seems impossible that someone would not read now, because we do have our phones. We have our phones feeding us news headlines all day. We must be reading some of those things sometimes. Yeah. If I were trying to make the person be more interested in reading fiction or literature, I would probably start with something very short. I would maybe recommend a book of very short works. They could get their feet wet that way and get into it. I went to New Zealand a few years ago and I bought this book, and it was short stories. They were like a page and a half long each. Bunch of different New Zealand writers, and I loved it. And I like to read. But I think that something like that would be good if a person doesn't like to read books. But surely everyone who can read is reading articles now.
Yeah.
Or maybe not.
So your approach is top style.
Yes. Grays.
But I did work at a bookstore, and around Christmas, for about 10 years, and around Christmas I'd get up, my uncle doesn't read, what's a book you'd recommend? So I mean, that's tough, because you're trying to,
Go to the liquor store.
Yeah, but I think there's certain books now that get into the zeitgeist. So that's another way I would talk about, especially some great work in nonfiction. I think there's a lot of great work in the kind of, I don't want to say, it seems to have a demeaning quality to the term, but I don't think it is demeaning, but then kind of the self-help or kind of wellness literature. John Kabat-Zinn, I think his name. So that's people often want to start reading about themselves. There's great books in that way. Sometimes if a person is coming from a particular point of view in life, maybe one of my students came out recently, which is a pretty hard thing to do in Turkey. And so I recommended some books that maybe he wouldn't feel so alone on a kind of obvious sense. Some gay writers, or at least are topical. So.
Yeah, I think for me, it would also have to do with the conversation and my history with the person. But I do want to just tell a quick anecdote about somebody who hadn't been reading for a while that I gave a book to, because I think it's a really powerful one. And generally, I kind of have this negative reaction to a overly utilitarian idea of like what a book can do in your life. Like you'll see these headlines right now, these poems are an act of resistance, things like that. And I think that's a bit much. But my grandmother, about 5 years ago, she'd been living very independently. She fell and broke her hip and got very sick and was living in assisted living for the first time in her life. And she was really down and not sure, how much more life she had in her. And my mom was taking care of her, and my old copy of The Magic Mountain by Thomas Mann, which isn't usually a book you give to an ailing grandmother, happened to be with my mom, and she left it in her room. And this is a book about people, with tuberculosis and all these diseases in a sanatorium, and it's on the verge of World War I, and the whole thing's just overdetermined and wrought with death and physicality and the failure of the body. And my grandmother read this book, though, and there's a section where one of the main characters, who's very unwell, is struggling through the snow, and he's about to die, and his thoughts this whole time have been filled with death and his mortality. And he emerges at the end of it, and it's a line, again, this is what I meant earlier when I said removing a single line and using it as an aphorism wouldn't work, because this line, if you stitched it and put it over your door, it would mean nothing. But in the context that we had just gone through with this character, and it said, "For the sake of goodness and love, I shall grant death no dominion over my thoughts." And my grandmother read that whole book, and at the end of it, it sounds almost fake, but it really did give her new life, and it was such an amazing thing to see in terms of just a book that she encountered at the right time, a very unexpected one I wouldn't have sent her at the moment, but yeah.
Well, and replacing that word encounter, how that word encounter is emphasized as opposed to how we usually meet literature in high school, which is, did you find all the symbols on page 7? And when I taught Steinbeck in college on the notice, the class notice, the course description, and the first thing I usually said in the class was, "This is not your high school's Steinbeck," because so many people read it too early and they're turned off to it. Either they didn't like the teacher, or it's just a difficult time, or they didn't get all the symbols, and it's so. You have to kind of almost mathematical. You need to solve for X, and if you're not solving for X, there's something wrong with you. And I think a lot of people get turned off to reading early because of that, and emphasizing the encounter was beautifully said, was a great story.
I like the way you asked the question, Amanda, because you said something about magic and potions at the beginning, and I think you're talking about teaching, which is what these guys are talking about too. I'll just tell you a brief story. I hate following Matthew. That's such a beautiful story. But there was a time when I was just traveling around the country, and I would write in coffee shops and such, and a woman came and sat down by me one time in Ely, Minnesota, up near the Canadian border, and she said, "Can I tell you about the Bible?" And I said, "No, I'm good, really." And she said, "Yeah, but did you know that in the Gospel of John it says this?" And I said, "No, that's not the Gospel of John, that's the book of James, and in Greek it says this, and actually that's not part of the original text, and you don't get that text until about 3rd century CE, and by the way, that wasn't in the original canon of the New Testament." And she just went, "Who are you?" And I said, "I'm nobody, who are you?" Quoting Emily Dickinson. That's my story. Oh, okay. Wendy?
Wendy! Hi, Wendy.
So when I was young, we did Richard Bach.
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
Jonathan Livingston Seagull.
Yes.
Little Women, I can't remember who the author was for that. Leo Boscalia, obviously,
Yeah.
A.J. Miles with the towel and food.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah.
My last daughter, like this nice lady said, what do you do to encourage Dharmakaya because I was studying with the Dalai Lama when I was 5.
I'm really glad you brought up Jonathan Livingston Seagull, because that's what I meant about these books that are quote-unquote light or accessible. And that I just throw The Alchemist at a person. And there was some professors on my campus that kind of questioned why I was teaching The Alchemist at an undergraduate level. And I said, well, I'm also teaching The Little Prince. So I think anything that facilitates that encounter, because I think ultimately it's about a kind of fear of the text, or I'm not smart enough, or I was never good at it, or I just never got into the habit. So those books are amazing for that. And Richard Bach, I mean, it was as if it could come out today. Yes, great. Yeah. Yeah.
I have to thank James for saving me from my academic self, because I'm one of those people like, what are you doing? You can't teach that. That's not in the canon, even in the expanded canon. That's popular literature.
Popular literature.
Yeah, and so I remember we became friends at this university, and he said, let's watch a movie one night, and we'll get some pizza and some vodka and we'll watch a movie. And I'm like, great. And I'm thinking, some David Lynch or, some brilliant auteur. And he's like, we're going to watch Titanic. And I'm like, I'm not sure I'm allowed to watch that as a professor of literature. And it was a great night. He stopped the movie at the opening with the light in the ocean where they're searching the wreckage. And he's like, stop. And I'm like, what do you, he's like, Genesis 1:1. I'm like, stop. So thank you for saving me from my academic self.
And the Spider Woman telling the story, educating all the men about their superficial understandings of materiality. And she held the story, yeah.
Sutinder?
Is there a novel that has... Do you have a novel each that made the most impact on you?
Wow. Walt Whitman, anything. Leaves of Grass.
And the Tao Te Ching.
Tao Te Ching, yes, absolutely. I should say, in relation to that other story, I get my teaching philosophy from the Tao Te Ching, which one of the lines is, the master creates confusion in those who think they know. So that's why I did that to that poor woman in the coffee shop. I was being a good Taoist.
I mean, for me, it was Notes from the Underground that I read a copy of my grandfather, who was a Methodist priest, and very, very well read, and it was in his library. He had died when I was 2, and it was a little 5-cent paperback from the 50s, and it had all these notes in it, and he's there. His presence was there, and I didn't understand any of it because I was like 12, but I've gone on and read that through multiple teachings, multiple times, multiple settings. Probably Notes from the Underground. There's something about this voice. Something about that was the encounter. Literally in its form, but something about this encounter that I'm talking about was very vivid then. And then I would say Steinbeck's Cannery Row. Yeah.
Yeah, I had 2 as well, and one was Steinbeck's Cannery Row. That's one I've reread probably as much or more than any other book. And Steinbeck, as you know, this person that, as James said earlier, is kind of relegated to somebody you read in high school, and this is what would be considered a secondary work of his, Under East of Eden or Grapes of Wrath. But the prose is so beautiful. You get these great moments of epiphany and whether or not they sustain, and it's just it's a great book, and it's a great book that you can go to a place where one of the central settings in the novel still exists, that lab, and just encounter it in these new ways. And then Another answer would be Ulysses by James Joyce, because I took a month-long class on that when I was 19, and my girlfriend took the same class, and it was 5 days a week. You'd go to class for 3 hours. We'd go back, read the book with the annotations and the Odyssey all side by side, and just seeing all these different layers in front of me and these different ways of reading and these different things language could do just really opened up my eyes in a way that was amazing at age 19. So.
And I know that class, that was you would finish the class and then start reading and sleep for a few hours all the way up until the next class. But it's something about, I'm kind of obsessed with this notion of ritual. Maybe I'll write about it, but ritualizing reading, and that's one thing that I've started to do is try, because when you're in a class, or maybe even a book club too, but there's this notion of having to go and sit and get outside and read regularly. That's something that once we go into the world, we become secondary. We read before bed or on the metro or something, but trying to be more intentional about finding reading time, making space for that. With prayer, they're talking about make space for the divine or meditation, but I've really tried to think about reading as making space for that encounter and all these things that we've talked about, whether it's cultural understanding, intellectual expansion, empathy, or that's something else, that encounter that's maybe transcendent.
The only thing I can think of right now is Alice's Adventures in Wonderland and Through the Looking Glass.
Wow, that's good.
That's actually a perfect segue.
Hi, Sharon.
We're on the same wavelength.
Good.
Because I really wanted to hear, if you'd like to share with us, what's your earliest memory of, like, that book with the little you that you just felt like the world fell away and you just really responded to it.
One of my childhood homes was it had a very big backyard. It used to be an apple orchard, and there was a big garden and a big apple tree. And I got a copy of the Complete Fairy Tales of the Brothers Grimm, and I would read it under this apple tree. And it became my favorite thing, which, those are very violent, scary stories. So that's probably where I developed my early, literary bloodlust kind of thing.
Literary bloodlust?
Yeah.
That's amazing. That's another good title. Write that down. I'll write that down.
Yeah, fairy tales.
We've been talking, we've drawn some names tonight of some authors that have, truthfully speaking, problematic past.
Lewis Carroll.
I think every name.
Yeah, there's
Okay,
yeah.
so just knowing that, I have a book that introduced me to, it was finally a woman author, fantasy. It was perfect, it was beautiful, it was rich, it was expansive. But I found out about her. And now I'm afraid to tell people I like that book. How do we reconcile the text away from the author if they're problematic?
I still like some R. Kelly songs, and now I feel ashamed about it.
Right, but we can't promote that. Like, we can't give money to these people.
I wish I had answers about separating the art from the artist. I think about this every day, though. When you find out personal information about someone whose work you like, it can make it really challenging to continue liking their work. And I wish I had an answer. Do you guys have answers?
It's a lot.
I know they are different things, but how can I tell people, read this author? Because I love this book, it was a magical opening.
Also now
It's helpful if the author's dead.
Yeah, it's helpful if the author's dead and of a time when...
But and it's not just the literary figures. I mean, musicians,
It's
of
everyone.
art, of actors,
It's every creative human being.
screenwriters,
Yeah.
filmmakers.
I'd like to believe that the work can support itself and live separately.
Some of it can.
Yeah, it can, absolutely, but when I utter that title and I think of, that file, shit.
Yeah.
I mean, even if you can say that, a lot of theorists since Derrida have said once you kind of create an utterance, or which could be, Bakhtin calls it a book in utterance. It could be one sentence or it could be 900 pages. It goes out into the world, and even if I tried to write this tract saying one thing, language works another way, the readers bring their own story to it, it's gone, it's out in the world. But, even if you can kind of get a person to that point, then often it comes down to economics. do you want to kind of vote with your money and support this behavior? And that's
Easier to vote with those dollars if the person is dead, you're right.
yeah, and that's difficult. But I mean, the people we've mentioned, like Steinbeck's Cannery Row, for example, is a book that I really love. But did he really portray the prostitutes in a way that I would find edifying about what they go through? Probably not. So I think the problems enhance the reading in that sense when the person is gone, or it's another era. The guy who wrote King Arthur killed somebody. So they just become, the problems become opportunities in that sense. But it's something very distinct now about the kind of, I don't want to reduce it to economics, but that's a way of supporting or condoning. They think you condone that behavior. I don't know. That's really interesting.
Yeah, approaching it with empathy seems like it would be key.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Is there just to interject there, is there any parallel with engaging with works of art that are controversial? I'm just thinking of the Satanic Verses by Salman Rushdie.
Right.
Okay. So we all know that the Fury. And I don't know why I didn't read it for years because of the controversy.
Oh.
Right. And it's one of my favourite books. I've read it multiple times. I think it's a brilliant piece of fiction, literature. But is there any parallel between the piece of art, whether it's a piece of literature or a TV show that I don't know had Kevin Spacey in it, right? Or a film by Woody Allen,
right?
Or Polanski. And can we separate? Well, should we respect the art and afford it if it's of interest, if it piques if it matches our expectations in terms of genre or passions? Should we respect the art and afford it our attention? Because, as you say, we as readers, as viewers, as consumers, bring our own baggage to any piece of artistic work anyway, right? So, is it such a bad thing to say, to divorce the creator of that from? I'm sorry, that's not a formulated question there.
Is it a bad thing to divorce the creator from it?
Yes.
I don't think so.
It seems like
I think that's an educable moment because when you conflate the author with the narrator or the implied author or all that, you're not reading well. Now, does it affect you? Because sure, we're people and we live in a culture of spectacle and all that. But I quoted Sherman Alexie a while ago, and back of my mind, I'm like, oh, that guy who has his own problems now. But the work still stands, and it kind of stands in a unique way now because it transcended him. Yes. And it always had, but we forget. Yeah.
You had a question.
Well, yeah, I was just thinking out loud because, I don't necessarily want works of art created by perfect people.
No one's perfect, yeah.
But, I'm interested in, the thief who writes a novel, Jean Genet, the scoundrel, or the womanizer. Look at all of John Williams' poetry. So Adorno said every work of art is an uncommitted crime.
Wow.
Think about that for a minute. Think about if this artist didn't create that work of art, who they might have, how much worse their life would have been.
Where would that have come out instead?
That's genius.
I don't know. I think that we're living in this time when everyone wants to sanitize everything. So I'm kind of curious about the interplay between what a person might produce and who they are and bringing it to light or not bringing it to light. These are open questions I don't have the answer to.
Then there are people who sanitize their work but not their personal lives, and that can be a problem sometimes too.
Well, and also we're seeing works put on trial. You had mentioned Mark Twain. And now I think I can't remember the exact district, but there's going to be an addition that is the language has been heavily excised. So it's now appropriate to be taught or appropriate to be read. And I don't have an answer for that either, but I tend to be a little concerned about shaping text that way for us.
And I think, I don't think there's any way that I think we should grapple with these things without looking for a final resting place. I think that's what we've been getting to a lot here, is sitting with uncertainty and working through those uncertainties and working through those contradictions. And I think another important thing, this is one of the central points of this great book, Cassandra by Krista Wolf, is what does empathy actually mean? It's not always this beautiful and virtuous thing. Empathy means when you're face to face with your enemy, if you're actually empathetic, you see yourself in them. And that's not supposed to necessarily be empowering. That can actually be damning or very terrifying. But that's actually what empathy can actually be when we expand on it and think about it fully.
Yeah, as I was driving over, I was thinking that notion where Christ says, whenever two people are gathered in my name, I'm there. And I'm thinking about how with Matt and I on a porch 10 years ago in a little university in Southern California talking about Cannery Row, I mean, there's a similar, the work is there. Not everything John Steinbeck wanted, because the work is its own thing now. And so, but it is this notion of coming together, and one of the things it serves is empathy in the larger sense and edification. It's almost a distancing of the other in a way that Greg talked about. But, Greg spoke about his past in Tennessee and the text he was given. And, we do have the Puritan strand going through our culture. And I'm not that as surprised that I do think there's a kind of shaming or a fear of being tainted, but it's a long history in America. It was one of our founding strains.
Go ahead.
Yeah, but, I mean, we didn't make bad choices. It was like criminal behavior that people were really hurt.
Right.
And I think that it's like, you mentioned Woody Allen earlier, and I wonder, like he's in his movies. All his movies are about like, what if a funny guy had an inappropriate and disgusting relationship with a young woman?
Totally. Unlike Polanski's films,
when
which.
I take this in, I actually am taking him in. Like,
Yeah.
I'm actually taking that person into my mind. I guess I just like my frustration in this is looking at like taking down these gods as if it's like a real loss for all of us or for everyone in the future. And it's like an opportunity to find, this whole thing has been about like continuing to enrich yourself, and like if one of your gods gets taken down, I feel like I see so many people working to like, it's like they're spending so much time scaffolding that person up, and they can spend any of that time and energy finding like 300 new people that they love.
Right.
Yes.
Right.
I just don't know, like I love what you said about like, maybe there aren't firm answers. I guess like maybe we could just kind of like give it up for a minute and not like dig in so hard behind these people that like are terrible, like actually terrible. Instead like just like look for, a bunch of other movies or a bunch of other books or just like now. Maybe some of those people will be taken down, and I'm not saying like everybody has to pass a purity test, but do we have to go back to the same sources again and again? We look other places.
I love what you said, because looking around now, and I think literature is part of this, is there's an abundance in the world. And I can watch a movie made by some person in Vietnam on his cell phone instead of going to Woody Allen. So I completely agree. And texts are everywhere. And I think that's a great way to look at it. And I don't think, one time I was complaining to my fiance about, I have so many books to read, I haven't read anything, I have more books to read. And she just said, there's only one book that matters. It's the book of life. And I was like, you know, it sounds like a bumper sticker, but at the time it was really powerful. I was like, and then that made me think of what do I want out of my reading, and that's really paying attention and all this other stuff. I agree wholeheartedly about that. I don't think that there's 8 filmmakers that we should have as iconic and everyone else just makes films. And same thing with the literature. And one of the amazing things is now there's more people writing than ever. And it's more easy to get a platform. I mean, I think a book is different than a blog, but I'm just saying there's more people telling stories than ever before. But maybe not as many people reading them, or reading them with the way that we're talking about. But that's an excellent point. Maybe that's that kind of natural answer to these, you know, big names, these kind of household brands, that we don't have to be tyrannized by them.
You know who gets I may be wrong about this, so tell me if I'm wrong, but you know who gets a pass on this is Bukowski, who was married right here, by the way. We have married in the library.
Right? Yeah.
Oh, you didn't know that? Oh, that's Bukowski and Linda.
Yeah.
And again, maybe no, it's Charles Bukowski. Wow. Yeah. Hey, my thesis is, which may well be wrong, is that he gets a pass, maybe he doesn't get a pass, but if he does, it's because he embeds the brokenness in the work.
Yeah.
Whereas it's easier for an actor not to do that. I don't know, Woody Allen, I don't know if that's brokenness he's portraying, but Bukowski is certainly bleeding on the page. And maybe that's why he gets a pass, maybe that's because he was a jerk, clearly. But maybe that's why he deserves a pass, I don't know.
It helps.
His work is authentic.
He was an authentic asshole who could write like hell.
Self-awareness helps.
What's that?
Self-awareness really helps. I mean, it does help
dead?
that he
Who's
bled on the
dead?
page.
Who's dead?
Well, he's recently dead,
Yeah.
right.
Yes.
Just to follow on that, like, I think we're talking about 2 different things. One is, I mean, the art itself, so the novel, the poem, the literature itself, has to be honest and authentic. So when Jean Genet writes Thief's Journal and he's a prostitute and a thief and maybe a murderer, that's actually what he's writing about. When George Orwell talks about down and out in London and Paris and he's stealing and living the low life, that's actually what he's talking about. So there's an authenticity. I mean, and your point was quite good, like you don't want to sanitize necessarily the work to get this phony image of who you are. Whereas in that, you know, acting is obviously quite different things. So, that in conversation, what's the different strategy?
Well, that's one extent what you said earlier too, which is the work of art might be the one time the person got it right.
As opposed to their entire life.
Most of our lives, you know, what's that quote? Every life would be from the inside is a series of failures, right? And yet these are the people that created things. And, you know, it becomes a slippery slope. And I totally understand what you're saying about films and stuff. And I think it's a healthy way of being, because the wider net you cast, the more you do learn. Just accepting somebody as canonical because everybody else deems it so,
Right.
you might miss something. But I also think it's idiotic to dismiss masterpieces because the person who created it was compromised. Because honestly, you turn over any rock and there's going to be things you don't want to see.
Everyone's been compromised at some point to some degree.
You mentioned James Joyce.
Right.
He was a horrible person.
Yeah.
You know?
I also, I think, so people talk about this many times, but one that comes to mind in literature is Tolstoy in War and Peace, talking about these figureheads and how they represent these moments in the war, these movements. But what was really happening was the phenomena that they were the figurehead for, not what they were actually doing. And I think we still see that in today's political moments, which is why I'm less concerned with like the proclivities of a certain politician than the movement that is represented by them. And I think in many works of art, especially ones that have been around for generations and that there's this whole ongoing discourse generated by, I think if that piece of literature has become its own phenomenon that's so widely discussed and where this discourse is so rich and ongoing, then at that point, and I do think this is probably different with living artists, but at that point, the author's own history doesn't matter so much because this thing has taken on a new life and it's been talked about, it's still being talked about, it's still being rediscovered, still regenerated, and still put into dialogue with new things.
And the things that become reading phenomena fascinate me, like a 50 Shades of Grey phenomena. I'll never forget, and I know I've maybe moved away from your masterpiece point, but I'm fascinated with, reading is kind of archaic or maybe esoteric in the way we're trying to talk about it today. That's how it's seen. But, walking into Walmart and seeing 50 Shades of Grey and I've never seen more people read that book on the Metro in New York than ever. I mean, there's some, whether you like that, or Twilight is another one.
I read Twilight when my son was a baby.
Yeah.
I read
Everybody.
all 4 of them.
Right.
All of my friends read them too.
Yeah.
We were all in our 30s at the time, and we
Yeah.
were all reading Twilight.
Right. And I think you may agree with me that it's not a masterpiece.
It's
but
very
there's
bad.
something, and Harry
All
Potter.
4 of them, though.
Yeah, Harry Potter is really well written, I think. And I was working at a bookstore, and people would line up at midnight and come out. And so, to me, these are all symptoms or like symbols of the seeking, of the thing that you can find in literature, of a kind of thirst. And a cynic might say, well, they're not going to find it there. But I would say that it's always exciting when there is a kind of reading phenomena in the culture, especially today when there's so many other things to do. And I think that can be a beginning on the path to encountering literature in the way that we're talking about.
Nick?
Well, maybe a flip side of talking about all this is with art for art's sake, which kind of gets left behind in the discussions, become more political. So is there room for art for art's sake these days? Is there even such a thing?
Sounds like next week's panel.
No, there isn't.
No. Yeah, I think.
Anybody else?
Well, yeah, that's Tuesday's lecture. I didn't say that. Do not quote me. I didn't say that. That was G. Debord in Society of the Spectacle from Tuesday night's lecture. I don't think there was ever art for art's sake. I think that was a nice idea, but art is constructed. It's socially constructed, and we should say that.
And even some of the great writers, like Henry James, for example, talking about how, the writing for the writing's sake, that's still a kind of political point of view.
Yeah.
So you can't get out of the pool. Yes. We're social animals, we're political animals. And as Matt talked about in his intro, and the books don't stay in the pages. And that's whether we're going to be writing about someone outside of my gender or ethnicity or age. I have to approach it in a certain way now that maybe I wouldn't have done in 1890. I mean, that's real. And as we read, same thing. And so, yeah, I think Greg's right about, I don't think books ever just stayed in the pages quietly, where you can just consume through entertainment and then put it down and move on. I think they've always been more dangerous, some people would say, or more powerful in being able to expand the person or introduce them into levels of understanding or connection that they didn't anticipate, and they put the book down different than when they started it. I'm curious about recommendations, because someone asked us about our readings that really impacted us, whether we were young or maybe in our early 20s. I'd love to hear some of those. Some of you guys answer that question, where you had that encounter, that powerful reading experience.
You look like you have an answer, Sutinder.
Yeah, Sutinder wants to speak.
Yeah.
I was very, I think I was like 9 years old when I read Lord of the Rings.
Oh, wow.
And then I read it 3 summers on the trot. I read it every summer holidays for 3 years, I think. And it was the whole world, it was the universe, you know. And I've never come across anything as powerful. And I've read all my life. I'm a writer now as well, and I haven't read it for decades. But I thought what Tolkien achieved there was really a singular achievement. It's phenomenal. And all of life is there. And it's, you know, it's much more than just a fantasy. So, and I can remember going into the library with something else after, and the librarian said, "Oh, you can't read that now. You read it." And I had no idea what she meant. There was there were levels of literature, of book.
Yeah.
At 9 years old, I didn't know things were.
Right. Well, this is kind of a plug for an upcoming event because I know he's speaking here in either March or April, but Dr. Heller has a great story about the first time he was reading Lord of the Rings in Hollywood as when he had come here, and he's standing in line to pay his electric bill, because at that time you could kind of go pay, and of course he was waiting for the last day to pay, so he was in line waiting to pay, and he's reading Lord of the Rings, and someone walked by and just stopped and said, "You're so lucky. You've never read Lord of the Rings." And then, yeah, he's read it every year since.
Yes?
So I just want to say, when I was a kid, I found a copy of Anaya's Names.
Oh, boy. Oh, boy. She was my favorite in high school.
That was, well, first of all, because it was my father's bookshelf, right?
Oh, boy.
Wow, that opened my eyes. It's really a beautiful, incredible, powerful, just you know, that line from Whitman that says, "Tear the doors from the hinges, tear the hinges from the doors." Like just tearing everything up. For me, it was amazing. And I went back and I read her diary. Those are amazing, especially the encounters with Henry Miller, and then the unexpurgated incest. There's one called Incest, which was a consensual adult relationship with her father, which was, she was in love with her mother and having sex with her. That blew me away. So, but I just want to say, the thing that really, really disrupted my life was when I was about 14, and I was very disturbed. I was about 15, I was very full of angst, and a teenager, very sullen and dark. And gave me a copy of the poems of Rilke, the writer.
Oh, yeah.
Wow.
And it was as if that voice was reaching out to me across the centuries, speaking only to me and piercing through my ego armor, and so intimate and so arresting that I went and I learned German so I could read them in the original, and I went to Germany so I could study them over there, and I still carry him around with me. He's still my companion. And talking about, I love that line where it reads you, like Rilke is someone, he reads you.
Right.
He's just arresting. And there's that one line those last two lines that haunt him from the end of his poem, Archaic Torso of Apollo.
Yes.
Which is,
Yes.
"For here there is no place that does not see you. You must change your life."
Yes.
Wow.
That's great.
That's all I got to say.
That's great.
Thank you. Come on, A.B.
No, you guys know it.
I do.
Okay, so we'll all have a good laugh, but I was often alone as a child, off on my own, trying to entertain myself. And the one person that was a great storyteller for me, in my developmental years, was Stephen King.
Oh.
That's great.
some challenging stuff for a young girl, but from there I went to Ireland, and from there I got into much more sweeping I love science fiction and fantasy, and then I got into role-playing games, and then I was like, oh, now I'm really a part of a community that won't have me because the woman author that I was speaking about that I loved so much until I found out about her was Marion Zimmer Bradley.
Oh, yeah.
The Mists of Avalon.
Oh,
yeah, huge book.
Yeah.
Shot me off. I was like, wow, maybe I could be a writer. I would love to do something this meaningful for someone else.
Wow.
But, and now I'm a nonfiction person. And now I'm a, ancient wisdom, secret wisdom, occult reader. I don't know. I mean, my roommate gives me a lot of things, recommends me a lot of feminist critique, and she's got great taste in books, and she's read all this stuff that sometimes I just need a bit of escape, and for me, that bubble gum is Stephen King, to be honest with you.
I read a lot of V.C. Andrews in my adolescence.
Oh my God.
Speaking of incest.
Horrifying.
Oh my God. Yeah.
Horrifying.
But amazing.
I can't cope with the sexuality that
Oh, it was so much, and I was like 12. It was a little too young. Anyone? No? Nick? Frankie, thank you.
I'll fess up that I hated literature and English in school. Now it's good enough, but it was mostly to be contrarian when in my senior year when I had to write a book or anything I wanted. I sought out the thing that would just make teacher I loved the most was Oscar Wilde's Dick Profundus.
Wow.
It blew me away, and it crumbled my whole world and caused me to like literature from that moment on, even though I had no clue what it was about, what it meant, except for like what a 17-year-old kid could have gotten from it. It's my most marked up book at home. I've probably read it in total a dozen times, but I read it weekly, some section of it. I'll just pick it up and while I'm cooking and grab it. It's perfect.
That's great.
I'll just say a recent thing, actually, maybe. I recently read a great novel, which is The First Bad Man by Miranda July. She's a filmmaker I really love also. She's such a great writer. And then there's a very nerdy thing that I've been doing the last couple of years where if I like a book, then I check and I see if it's on Audible, and after them reading it, I go listen to it.
Wow.
She actually reads it.
Wow.
I got to read the book and
Yeah.
her read
Oh, that's great.
Army Hammer reads Call by Your Name. So
Wow.
it's,
Oh.
Anyway, just a recommendation I have to anybody that's in here.
That's a good idea.
Thank you.
But it's like one of the coolest,
Yeah.
mind-blowing ways to interact with like new works or anything that might be on there because you can
Yeah.
you have your experience with it at your house and they can like travel with you through your day. And,
Yeah.
especially if it's the author reading it, or like Claire Danes does Handmaid's Tale, so it's like really talented people.
Oh, fun.
Investment. Anyway, just a cool way.
What's your name, by the way, so I can call you by
My
it?
name's Cameron.
Cameron.
Yeah.
Nice to meet you.
Yeah.
That's a
Frankie?
great, I'm thinking, I guess I mentioned multiple times already, that kind of to ritualize it. That's a really cool idea. And if anyone has like 14 hours that they're looking to fill, you have got to listen to Jeremy Irons read Lolita.
Oh.
It's unabridged, and he played it in the movie.
Yes.
But the narrator is more interesting than the character in the movie. And so because it's a first-person narrative and the nuance he brings to it, because a great reader would do one thing, but he had spent all that time researching the character, and I listened to it driving around LA, and it's like I had Humbert in the back of my car telling me the story. It's unbelievable. And that's technically one of the most amazing books I've ever read. And to hear that caliber of actor who prepared for all that time to bring that role to life and then to read it was really amazing, because I don't know another case like it where you have the combination of talent, the acting ability, and then reading a first-person text like that.
And
So,
a really wonderful voice.
Yeah.
Just, oh my God.
yeah.
Frankie.
We're gonna go audiobook. This might give that one a run for its money, but it's John Cleese.
Oh, okay.
Street Tape Letters.
Okay, yeah, that would be amazing.
Sharon or David?
I read The Hobbit, which is why I've been being quiet, because,
Thinking about all the food in The Hobbit? I am.
well, no, I love it. When I was, I was young.
Yeah.
And, I drew a map of my backyard that was mortar and, But then again, I read it later and realized
Right.
that it was about fascism and all these other things, and Lord of the Rings, and that was remarkable. But a story that changed my life, actually, starting in a horrible English lit class in high school, was stumbling upon Carson McCullers' The Jockey, the short story. And there was something about it that just made my brain itch. And I didn't like it at the time, but it stuck with me, and it stuck with me, and it stuck with me. And then I started reading, The Heart is a Lonely Hunter, and it's opened up this whole world of this sort of, for lack of a better way of putting it, the Southern Gothic.
Yeah. Yeah.
But that was an interesting thing for me because it wasn't a pleasure to read at the time, both because it was assigned,
Right.
and I also, it gave me the creeps. But then it stuck with me.
Yeah.
James, you've touched on Steinbeck a few times. Is he the best American author?
It's a trick, don't answer it.
Yeah, I mean, the category, I don't really hold much kind of stake in those kinds of categories. I think that we live in a world of abundance, and it's more like best for who. But I do think it's great to have a constellation of American writers that we can say have achieved at a high level. I think he's often forgotten. I mean, Hemingway used to say, I need to write a Steinbeck, which was a kind of short, quick novel that would be made into a great film. I think he's kind of underappreciated in some ways, but he's won, I think, on a sentence by sentence level, and mostly what Gore Vidal said about people. He looked at people that often people hadn't looked at before, and his constructions of Grapes of Wrath are pretty powerful. And he's interesting because he simultaneously critiqued a kind of America, but also then created an America. This was really interesting, like in Of Mice and Men. But there's a great Steinbeck story where he was invited to Russia because the Russians read Grapes of Wrath and thought he was a communist. So they allowed him to come to Russia in the height of the Cold War, early Cold War, and with a photographer, and let him go wherever he wanted. I mean, they kind of scripted where he would go, but he wrote about it. But he had drunk one day and kind of passed out on a bench, and a policeman came up and said, "Sir, you shouldn't be lying here." And I think it was in the Kremlin area, and he didn't know any Russian. He's kind of all hungover, and he said all he knew was Amerikansky auteur, like American author. And the policeman said, "Oh yeah, Hemingway, Mr. Hemingway." So I mean, I think Steinbeck is well worth reading, and in that way he's the best, but America has a lot of great writers, some of which aren't even done yet, not even close to being done, some of which haven't got started, some of which from voices we hadn't heard from before.
I also think it's interesting when people bring up the question of best writer from a certain country or era or any of this. I think of Roberto Bolaño, who is this great Chilean writer who became an expat after he escaped. He was arrested by Pinochet after the coup, and he escaped and traveled Latin America and traveled Europe. And we talk about literature as a roadmap when he writes his own, basically epic of his own life as a young poet, The Savage Detectives. His roadmap is losing teeth as he travels, like the less teeth he has as he's traveling around writing this poetry. But anyhow, he was kind of iconoclastic with all these Latin American and eventually Spanish writers. He hated Neruda, hated Paz, would write these screeds against them. And when people asked him, "Are you a Mexican author, a Chilean author, a Spanish author?" he said, "An author has no country, he has a language." Yeah.
I think we're approaching, or maybe past 9, so I'll just say 2 words. Any discussion of best or great or whatever America has to include Toni Morrison. Thank you for coming out.
Thank you for coming.